7:05. Yes, got it.
Do you want me to start, or do you want to introduce, set the space?
I'll set the space, and I'll introduce you based on the words you gave to Caleb and I. And yeah. So thank you all for being here in this space to talk about how it is we show up as a faith community and as members of a larger community, a human community that is knit together in ways that are spiritual and also very material, because material is not divorced from the spiritual. As we talk about housing and listen to the stories and the information that Aaron will share with us, I want you to enter into this space with a spirit of curiosity and a spirit of openness. And also, in so much as you are able, whatever your day has taken you, wherever your day is leading you after this, because we don't only stop when the sun goes down. I invite you to take a breath, take a moment, and prepare your hearts. Well, I want to thank Aaron Burke for being here, and I will share with you a brief biography and anything, Aaron, that you want to amend or add to what you've given us. The floor will be yours after this, but I thank your presence here. So Aaron Burke is a spiritual being, a storyteller, a tender of the soil, a shepherd of social movements, and the people who keep them alive. Aaron works for Jewish Community Action as a community organizer, working on issues related to affordable housing, community development, gentrification, and displacement. His work focuses on the cultivation of spiritually gratifying community building that calls in the traditions and rituals of his ancestors, while supporting activists through leadership development and political growth as folk movements. Aaron lives in North Minneapolis on stolen Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. He uses he, him pronouns, and we are blessed to welcome him into our community this evening. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor Dan, and to Caleb for inviting me, and for all of you for showing up. I really am grateful to be here, and nice to be with you all. So again, my name is Aaron Burke. I use he, him pronouns. I am a child of the western suburbs. I grew up in Golden Valley and in Plymouth. Went to Armstrong High School. I almost said Hopkins High School, but I went to Armstrong High School. And yeah, so have been sort of in this part of the world for most of my life. My family still lives in Golden Valley. And for the last 4 years, I've had a really lovely opportunity to work at Jewish Community Action. I grew up in the Jewish community, attending Adath Yeshurun Synagogue, which is in Minnetonka, and have been very involved in the Jewish community, and strangely did not know about Jewish Community Action as an organization until I turned about 25. And I started as a volunteer, getting very involved in efforts around criminal justice reform. That was probably 2015, 2016, after I had an experience being a jury member in Hennepin County on a criminal drug case. And I found community organizing, and I never gave it up. And eventually I wanted to pursue this as a full-time career, and it has been 4 years since I joined JSA on staff, and it has been really lovely. And so that's a little extended bio. I gave Pastor Dan the more poetic version, and so that is sort of who I am and where I'm from. I'm wondering if before I fully get into it, since we're kind of a smaller crew, if you'd be willing to introduce yourselves to me so I can know a little bit about who you are, if we have time. That's okay? Cool. Anyone like to start?
Sure, I'll start. I'm John Carlotto, my wife Shar. We've lived within a mile of our present location for all of our lives. So we're kind of invested in the area. And we've gone to Wooddale/Vista for all our lives. And I'm very curious to find out more about how we go about influencing affordable housing. Because I think it's hard you can't legislate morality. And so trying to figure out how to convince people to become involved in more affordable options is something that I'm quite interested in discovering.
John?
I guess I'll just piggyback. I won't repeat the history, but I guess one of my things that I want to learn a little bit more about is I balked a little bit, and I do sometimes still. I have honestly, when they start talking about increasing density in the community, because we're losing our green, we're losing, a lot of those kind of things. Like we live 2 blocks from the church, and the houses around us are being remodeled into big mansions, and the sense of community feels like it's getting lost in this whole process. So I'm just curious as to what seems to be the direction or the rationale, or how can we get affordable housing without losing that sense of community and the environmental issues that get created when we become more concrete and less green.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I'm Ed, and this is Phyllis, my wife. We're retired. We're currently looking at what our next phase of living is going to be. We're in a 4-bedroom home with the 2 of us. All of our children are grown and living out on their own. And so we're looking at our options as far as moving into senior rentals or what those things are. And just understanding from an economic standpoint what that impact is to us living on retirement income. And looking at the cost of this stuff and saying, how do people, when they start up, how do they afford getting into housing? I mean, the costs are so ridiculous. And I know I work for Honeywell, and we hire people from all over the country, that we're one of the highest housing markets in the country, second probably only to places like Southern California. And how do people afford to buy homes? Starter homes if you're a young family, or if you have a bunch of kids, to get into a house. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Thanks, Ed.
I'm Lori Johnson. I've been living in St. Louis Park we've been living in St. Louis Park for, 40 years. Been a part of Wooddale Vista for many, many of those years. I grew up in southern Minnesota in a small town. And I'm just interested in just being open and hearing more about affordable housing. I know there's a huge need. Housing is a real crisis. So I'm just really open to hearing more about it, learning more about it.
And I'm Judy, and I have, let's see, I've lived in St. Louis Park for, well, we moved when I was 5. We lived in more South Minneapolis. And then in a house that my great grandfather had actually built when he came over from Sweden. But anyway, the family chose to move to St. Louis Park, so I lived here for most part for my whole life. And I'm kind of like Lori, and I also with Shar too. Like, I want to learn more about affordable housing and what can we do to help create an atmosphere or a climate of accepting, having affordable housing. What does that really mean? What does it look like? I live on more of the western side of St. Louis Park, and they've torn down house after house, and they've built huge things, took a whole acre of green space, but it's for single families that I don't even know, I couldn't even afford to move into those homes now. And so, people they have a right to affordable housing in a good area. That's kind of what I believe. And I'm a retired teacher, so I see the impact of what not having affordable housing means to families. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Awesome. I really appreciate everything that you all said. And before I sort of get into the presentation I made, I hope it touches on a couple of those things. But also there should be plenty of time for us to sort of get in at the end to some of those real questions that, or have a discussion around those questions that you all are raising, or those really critical points. And before I start the presentation, the thing that I'll say is that one of my, I think, sentimental heroes in this work that I try to emulate on my best days of doing this is Mr. Rogers. And I think the way that Mr. Rogers talks about neighborhoods and communities is really the goal that we're trying to achieve. And I heard it from many of you tonight, of just sort of the sense of community and responsibility to your neighbors, and all of the things that Mr. Rogers would talk about on his show, I think is really the model of thriving community, and it's something to strive for. And so how do we as neighborhoods change, not only try to keep that, but to keep reinventing it, and making sure that it's something that we're both welcoming and continually doing the work of keeping that community alive. So I'm going to do my presentation briefly, and feel free to, if you have questions, I'm going to share my screen. So if you have questions, either there's like a raise the hand function, or just feel free to chime in and interrupt me. That is totally fine. I will not be upset at all. Here it is. I'm going to go present. All right, can you all see it?
Yep.
Great. So like I said, my name's Aaron. I'm a community organizer at Jewish Community Action. Our little logo is in the bottom there, and made this slide deck just for you all on housing justice in Hennepin County, and where sort of we've been and what we're, there we go, where we've been and what we're sort of the work that we're doing now. And I wanted to start that by talking a little bit about my tradition. Not sure how much any of you have or have not interacted with the Jewish community in St. Louis Park, which is fairly robust, even though I did not grow up specifically in that St. Louis Park sort of Orthodox community. But we're coming up on the time of year for a festival called Sukkot, which is a harvest festival. It starts, I think, September 18th this year. And so you may see around St. Louis Park or surrounding communities in Jewish backyards or in parks this sort of tent-like structure you see on the right side of the screen. And it's one of the observances of the holiday is that you spend the 8-day festival sleeping in this temporary structure called a sukkah. Plural is Sukkot, and that's the name of the holiday, is Sukkot. And one of the lessons that the rabbis teach about why we sleep in the sukkah is to really find awareness. And the sukkah, there are all of these specifications for how it's supposed to be built. It has to have a minimum, or I think a maximum of 2.5 walls, or maybe 3 full walls is like what it's supposed to be. And the roof is thatched with like corn stalks or dead sort of like sticks and things like that. And so you're really out there with the elements. And what I sort of take from the teachings of the rabbis is that what is important about sleeping in a sukkah is that you are aware of the elements around you. And I think, and it is inherently a temporary structure. And so I think it's a really good lesson of sleeping outside for 8 days in the sukkah. You are confronted with what shelter, what permanent shelter is and is not, and also how what the elements are sort of facing when you're out on the street. So it is it's a holiday that's coming up, and I thought has definitely a housing theme. So I just want to share a little bit about our tradition and some things you'll find one like resonant piece about it that relates to housing work. Happy to answer questions if there are any now, otherwise I'll keep going if you have specific Sukkot questions. Great. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition, which is one of the primary vectors or tables or roles that I hold at JCA. Suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition, or SHHC, was founded even before I started at JCA as a coalition of faith communities, social service providers, renters, and homeowners advocating for affordable housing in the West Metro. Organizations like STEP and other food shelves across the county, along with JCA and at the time Community Action Partnership of Hennepin County, as well as organizations like Homeline, that is a renter legal hotline and a nonprofit that provides legal advice. All sorts of housing related organizations came together specifically to address housing affordability and advocacy in suburban Hennepin County. Within a year of that organization starting to meet, the building Crossroads at Penn, which is right by Best Buy headquarters in Richfield, was bought by a new owner and is now called Concierge. And basically, this building was 800 one-bedroom apartments, all of which were built in the 60s and nothing really fancy. And in fact, we're home to a very diverse community, very working class, a lot of undocumented immigrants or immigrants generally, disabled folks, young families, all lived in this building, in this set of buildings. It was sort of a compound. And when it was bought overnight, it basically, all of the rents went up $500-600 month over month, because a lot of the families that have been living there were living on month-to-month leases. So the landlord had no obligation to give these people like a year's notice because their lease was year to year. They just had to say basically it's January 15th and starting in February, your rent goes up $500. You can either start to pay that or you can leave. And so within 3 months, almost 98% of the population at Crossroads had left after it became Concierge. And in addition to the rents going up, they made some aesthetic fixes to the building, like they painted the outside and they put in new countertops and they tried to clean the carpets, but they didn't replace them, and they painted over some of the mold, but the mold was still there. And so it was really devastating for the entire community, and especially it's portrayed in a documentary that's on YouTube called Sold Out: Affordable Housing at Risk. That's very good. It's about an hour. It was produced by TPT2, Public Access News, and the documentary even talks a lot about the school district in Richfield and how it lost like 100 kids that year, and how they had to fire several teachers from the school district because basically there was a mass exodus from the school system as all these families were kicked out. And so that happened, and a lot of our suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition partners tried to respond in the best way we could. But then it happened actually in Minnetonka at Meadowbrook on Excelsior not a year later, where that situation was a little funky, where the old owner sold it to her son, and the rents went up, and the building is now called Era on Meadowbrook, and there are some new luxury amenities, but a lot of the families that used to live there, including the Meadowbrook Collaborative offices, which were like co-funded by Meadowbrook, the apartment building, and also STEP, and also the city, was sort of dissolved. And there was a lot of families that were displaced from Meadowbrook and from the St. Louis Park community. And so a lot of our work over the last 4 years has been responding to instances just like that, where buildings get bought and sold, or sold and then bought, and there is, sort of mass redevelopment, and families sort of get pushed out of the community that they were living in. And so we developed what is called the 3 Ps: producing more affordable housing, preserving affordable housing that is at risk, and also protecting at-risk renters. And I would include a thing that has been coming up a lot more recently that several of you also mentioned, is the demolition of more reasonable, moderate starter single-family homes for the larger sort of like mansions that are put on these similarly, not huge lots. And I work with a team in St. Louis Park and a team in Minnetonka, and our team in Minnetonka and our team in Edina as well, all have had this as sort of like a phenomenon that we are seeing and trying to formulate policy around changing. And I can talk about some of the solutions that we've helped, the team in Edina actually helped develop for that particular situation as we get towards the end. Ooh, can't use the arrow, I need to use this. So I know from Caleb and Pastor Dan sort of that you've either had or are going to have conversations within Vista about housing being a racial justice issue, but I wanted to sort of at least talk briefly about our view at JCA. I didn't even intro JCA. I can do that in a little bit. I didn't put that in my slides. I was going to do it verbally, but I will do this slide first and I can come back to it. But just to say that at JCA, we believe that housing is a racial justice issue as well as an economic justice issue. And some of the things that I point to, which may or may not be familiar to you, is at the end, starting, after the Civil War, even thinking about Reconstruction and the time where we gave 40 acres to every Black family who was formerly a slave. And then at the end of Reconstruction, taking all of that land back and those homes back from them is sort of one of the first instances in this country outside of the country's colonization itself of, land and homes being given and then being taken back in a very racial way, a way that is antithetical maybe to values around racial justice. Very popular locally and in the news a lot these days is sort of housing covenants and the role that racial housing covenants played in sort of the New Deal era expansion of single family homes and the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota in Hamlin does a really great job of mapping the racial housing covenants. And so would lead you to resources from Mapping Prejudice for more specifics on that. We see a lot of our work as directly connected to the mortgage crisis in 2008, and seeing a lot of the low-income families who lost their homes in 2008 are now renters and are experiencing the kind of gentrification, the kind of neighborhood change that I just described at Meadowbrook and at Crossroads of, people lost their single family homes and became renters in between 2007 and 2010. And now a lot of those apartments prices are rising fairly drastically. And on top of that, obviously, so much has happened over the last 18 months, including job losses and huge investments in rent programs because of COVID. And so the state of Minnesota, I'll have a slide later on this, has several $100 million allocated to rental assistance that if people have been impacted by COVID are available to apply for. I think there's a smaller amount of money for mortgage relief. And so if there are needs in the Vista community, I have sort of the website later and would encourage everyone who needs help to apply as soon as possible, which I'll sort of get into around the eviction moratorium when I talk about that. I will pause for a second to see any questions at the moment. And maybe I'm going to turn on my light because I realize I'm getting dark. Any questions yet? Great. Well, I'll pause again just to say I work at Jewish Community Action. JCA is a 25-year-old nonprofit organization. Our office is in St. Paul, and we work statewide with the Jewish community and try to organize our members. We're a member-based organization around racial and economic justice issues in the Jewish community. So for us, we take a pretty expansive view of what that means. We mostly work with synagogues and unaffiliated Jews to try and organize around racial and economic justice. And we do that work both in partnership with directly impacted communities and then with our allies sort of in the progressive movement. We consider ourselves progressive organization that fights for racial and economic justice. And so my work every day is working with people, particularly around housing in the West Metro, where we have a lot of members. I will say that my family has roots like many many members of the Minneapolis Jewish community in St. Louis Park. I actually found census records from the 1940s of my family who lived in a house in North Minneapolis, not a few miles from where I'm currently living. And they paid $35 in rent for that house. But then within a decade, they had moved to St. Louis Park, and St. Louis Park was one of the first communities that welcomed Jews that wasn't redlined in the way, or did not have the housing covenants in the way that much of the rest of the Twin Cities did, that banned Jews and other minority groups from owning homes in those cities. So my mom grew up in St. Louis Park and is a proud graduate of St. Louis Park High School. And so this work, doing housing work in the West Metro, is something that personally for me feels really cool in that I can see sort of the journey of my family over the course of the last 100 years and how we were able to settle in St. Louis Park, and to be able to do housing work in St. Louis Park is really meaningful for me. Just a little bit about JCA. And I'll keep going then. So we focus a lot on sort of what's going on in rental housing in our campaigns, mostly because of sort of a lot of what has happened over the last 15 years around the fallout of the financial crisis, and seeing a lot of, poor people, working class people, and people who need housing assistance. A lot of folks, a lot of low-income folks, so lower on the socioeconomic income scale, are really in rental housing right now, and so we see a great need to work with people in renting, who are renting, as sort of bearing quite a bit of burden in terms of people who are directly impacted. And a couple of things that I have listed here are things that impede people's access to housing or keep people out of housing. So one thing that there's been a fair amount of research on recently by local foundations are credit scores. Almost anytime you apply for an apartment, you have to give them your credit score. They have to check your credit score. And what the foundations have found is that actually the credit score is not a great way to tell whether or not you'll be a good renter. But many renters either don't have credit, particularly, immigrant communities often end up renting. Maybe they don't have credit scores, and it's very hard for particularly large families without any credit to find an apartment that is suitable to them, and they don't really have the capital to invest into home ownership either. And so it's a huge roadblock for people. Also, sort of general background checks around criminal history and rental history. Particularly rental history is a thing that is very hard. If you have an eviction on your record anytime in the last 25 years, it could keep you out of getting future apartments approved. And so once you have one eviction, it really is very hard to keep yourself in stable housing. Often we'll see security deposits, fees, and income requirements as barriers to housing for folks as well. Particularly, sometimes a security deposit will be 2 or 3 months rent in addition to the first month's rent. So if you have to pay 2 months rent plus in the security deposit plus the first month's actual rent, it could be $3,600 up front, which is a lot. And then income requirements kind of gets into the question of what is affordable housing, which a lot of people like to say affordable housing is something where if you are paying less than 30% of your income, that housing is affordable to you. And what we're seeing these days is that more and more people are paying 40, 50, 60% of their monthly income to rent. And so if that is sort of the ratio that you have, then one, people are not in affordable housing or housing that's affordable to them. And two, it's likely that they won't even be able to access that housing because they don't make enough money. Fifth thing on the list is month-to-month leases, which I sort of talked about with Crossroads and with Meadowbrook, where there's flexibility there so that, if it's a pro-renter market where there's more than enough housing and rents are going down, maybe a month-to-month lease is really nice. It's quite a bit of flexibility, but in a really scarce market for housing like we have here in the Twin Cities, a month-to-month lease can be very scary because really the landlord can say on 1 or 2 months notice, your rent is going up, or I'm not going to renew you, and you're out. Sorry that it's January and you're going to be out in February, but our lease goes till January 31st, and after that you're out. So that can be very scary in a scarce housing market like we have currently. And then lastly is an issue that I'm working on right now in the city of Minneapolis, which is that there's no cap on yearly rent increases. So I think, as we'll see in either the next slide or the slide after this, rent prices are going up in the Twin Cities very, very quickly. And it's sort of churning people in and out of apartments in a way that really is not stable for anyone involved. So going to do that. So here, I took some data from Minnesota Housing Partnership, and I can pull it up and also put it in the chat, the report, if people are interested in reading through the chat. But the Minnesota Housing Partnership, I think their website is mhponline.org. They have a state of the state housing for 2021. And here were a couple of the key points that they had on sort of like their key takeaway page. But we talk about housing at this 30% AMI, which means 30% of the area median income. So that is really deeply affordable housing. The area median income in the Twin Cities is right around $100,000 per family per year. So housing affordable to folks at 30% AMI, you can think of if you were making $30,000 a year and that was your income, what could I pay in rent with, you know, that salary coming in every year or that wage coming in every year? And according to Minnesota Housing Partnership in 2021, there are nearly 170,000 Minnesotan renter households who need that level of affordability, but only 70,000 apartments available at that level. So there's a huge need for really deeply affordable housing that is not being met, and people are either overhoused or underhoused. And what I mean by that is either people are doubling up in apartments that are too small for them so they can share rent, you know, in like a 1-bedroom for 5 people so they can all split it and, you know, it's cheaper, or people are on the streets or they're hopping on couches or whatever it is. We know that there's a race gap in housing in Minnesota. Just 25% of Black households own their homes compared to 77% of white households. So Black folks are predominantly are more impacted as around issues of renting, and that is part of the logic of why at JCA we try and organize and follow the lead of Black-led organizations that are doing racial justice and housing justice work. And then this last point sort of gets to the thing that I was mentioning on the last slide, which is that the gross rent increased 14% year over year, while renter incomes only increased by 1%. So rents are going up a lot and incomes aren't matching that. It is pretty much the takeaway from that last point. Caleb and Pastor Dan wanted me to touch on the eviction moratorium, and so I pulled this beautiful graphic from the Homeline website, which is a partner that I mentioned before, but it's a free, Homeline is a free legal hotline for renters in Minnesota, all across Minnesota. And grateful for our governor, Tim Walz, who very early on in the pandemic, within the first week, instituted this eviction moratorium. And so for most of the pandemic, any sort of eviction was illegal and was kind of like paused for most of the pandemic. The legislature came to a off-ramp deal at the close of the last special session. And you can sort of see the timeline that is laid out here. But essentially, landlords could file evictions on June 30th for a very limited set of reasons, which did not include evictions for non-payment of rent, but basically like seriously endangers the safety of others, significantly damages property, things like that. In the middle of July, landlords could file evictions for material breach of lease violations, cannot file evictions for non-payment of rent. Just a few days ago, we entered into phase 3, where landlords can terminate leases and non-renew leases of tenants behind on rent and ineligible for COVID-19 emergency rental assistance. So if you're not eligible for rent help, then landlords can non-renew you or terminate your lease. And I anecdotally, from talking to friends at Homeline over the last couple of weeks, they have been getting a lot more calls to the hotline since we have approached August 13th and since then. And so as housing advocates, a lot of us are preparing for a lot of displacement and shakeup in sort of the rental market. The other dates that I would note is these dates in September and October, particularly in September, is one of the last deadlines to get in emergency rental assistance. And basically, the way they wrote this off-ramp legislation is that there are 3 or 4 months to apply to this state's rental assistance program. And if renters don't do that, then most of the protections end on October 12th. But if you do apply to the program before this date, which I believe is in September, you're protected until June of next summer. So you have a lot more time. And so it's really critical if anyone needs help and was impacted by COVID-19 over the last 18 months, who needs rental assistance. It's really important that over the next month and a half, people start to apply to that process, because you're not going to guarantee to get the money before October, but if you're in the system, that means that you get the protection until next June, which is huge, and there's more than enough money. But it's really a problem of getting people through the application and applied, and bureaucracy sometimes takes a long time for the applications to process, but really important people do get signed up. So this is a website. Would be worth if you have a congregational bulletin or email that goes out any week, if you know that you have congregants who are impacted. This is a really good resource. I will reiterate, it is sort of complicated to apply to, and not maybe the most straightforward or easy application, but you're able to get rents back paid to March of last year, and also 3 months into the future. So there's plenty of money available for people who are in need. So just really important that people are able to apply for it and get into the system before September. One of the last things that I'll share before sort of can open up for the conversation, and also happy to talk a lot about some of the work that is going on in Edina with this pilot program around single family homes that might be a little bit more interesting as well, is this rent stabilization campaign in Minneapolis that I'm currently working on. And rent stabilization, somewhat interchangeable with the term rent control, which we are hoping to demystify a little bit. So if you know anyone that lives in Minneapolis, and if you have congregants in Minneapolis who are interested in this sort of work, we're following the lead of a lot of renter-led organizations in this. And essentially, in Minnesota, it's been illegal for 4 or 5 decades. And that was sort of following a wave of policies in New York and San Francisco and other places, LA, that implemented rent control. The campaign that we're working on is going to go to the ballot in Minneapolis we have a mayoral race this year and city council races this year. And so it's going to be on the same ballot this fall. And basically would change our charter, which is similar to a city's constitution, to fit into one of the state loopholes in the state making the rent control illegal. This would fit into one of the loopholes in that law to allow the city of Minneapolis to author a future rent stabilization policy. And essentially what the policy would do is cap rental increases year over year at a to be determined percentage, and also adjust those rents for inflation. And we work with the coalition of Home to Stay Minneapolis, which is JCA, an organization called Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, which is Renters United for Justice in Spanish. And Take Action Minnesota, Isaiah, which is sort of like JCA, but works with primarily churches and mosques. And then also SEIU, which is one of the larger unions in the state. So we're working on that. That's primarily what my work is between now and November, is working on this campaign, which from my own personal experience doing this work for 4 years is one of the most important things that we can do, just seeing how many families have been at risk and have been displaced through rent increases, and any ability to control rents going up by hundreds and hundreds of dollars every year has been mostly illegal in the state of Minnesota. I think it's one of the things that we can do to really keep people stably housed in their community. is work on this. So that's a little bit of what I'm working on right now. And then the last slide that I have is sort of this ways to engage locally in housing advocacy. And Suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition has active teams in a lot of communities where, for what I'm told, Vista has a lot of members. St. Louis Park, Hopkins, and Edina are all 3 teams that I help support when I'm not working in Minneapolis, all of whom do a whole range of advocacy, really engaging in local city issues around housing, whether that be development of affordable housing or even multifamily housing generally in each city. I know we supported the development that you all are doing with the land on Highway 7, and then working on renter issues, sort of like I've been talking about tonight, but also working with STEP and supporting people who are at risk in their housing at STEP, and really taking, multi approach to like any sort of affordable housing advocacy. One way to get involved. 2, generally engaging with city council members on housing issues. I think, there may be elections coming up this year, and making sure that housing is a priority, or bringing up housing, whether it be in the lead up to an election or when those people are governing, is really important. And that's part of the work of the housing team, but can also be done outside of the housing team. I think it's really good for city council members to generally, and the mayor, be hearing about affordable housing issues. And then one of the projects that the St. Louis Park Housing Team has been working on, or members of the St. Louis Park Housing Team have been working on, is with Homeline, who I've mentioned a couple times already now. But basically door knocking people who have an eviction filed against them over the course of the pandemic. And in St. Louis Park, that list is fairly small each week, but we've had members go talk to those folks on the doors, make sure they're aware that they have a court hearing coming up, giving them resources for any sort of counsel they can seek through legal aid and places like that, and just making sure they're informed of what would happen if they don't show up to their court date. So that work has been really important in just making sure that renters are prepared, especially if they are at risk of getting evicted in a pandemic, which is just not the situation you want to be in. So I think those are all the slides I have. I feel like I've been talking for a while, so I would love to hear from all of you. How do I get I need to stop sharing is what I need to do. There we go.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I'm just gonna say sort of on that last bit about the community housing team, that's some work that Pastor Dan and Pastor Heidi and I have been engaged in a little bit, and staying connected in that, and then also the Homeline work. If you're interested in that, and you would be doing that with another person who's a part of this community housing team, and sort of going and supporting your neighbors who are, I cannot imagine. I've been fortunate to not have to have an eviction notice, but what that would be like, sort of what are all the mental calculations that you have to do, and to have a neighbor show up and say, hey, here's some resources, we're here for you, we care about you. That would be huge. And so you're gonna see, we're gonna try to put out some more information about that, but if you're interested, you can certainly talk to me, and I'll connect you with the folks on the team about that. And then also talking with city council members, Pastor Dan and Pastor Heidi, and I have done that with Councilmember Dumalog, who's sort of Vista's council member there in Ward 2 in St. Louis Park, and also with some folks in the city planning office of St. Louis Park as well, just in support of the Rise on 7 project. So, and what we did is we just emailed them, and we set up a meeting and wanted to talk to them. So sometimes I always feel that like a mystique of like, oh my gosh, this is an elected official. They have a title and everything. And it's, even in Minneapolis, which is a much larger city, I've had multiple conversations with my city council member just because I called them and emailed them, and we talked about what I was passionate about. So But if you're interested in those things, just wanted to highlight those and you'll see more coming out about that in the newsletter and just other communications soon. But thank you, Aaron, for all of that presentation, and we'll bring it back for other questions and thoughts that people have.
Yeah, and I will say I've been thinking about two things since our first go around, about one, sort of the density, losing green spaces, and also, maybe like sometimes there's a thing about, have any of you heard of the On Being podcast, or do any of you listen to On Being? They have sort of the, Krista and that whole crew there, they do those conversations across lines of difference as one of the things that they have a whole, I think, group that works on, of just like civil conversations. And one of my dreams, actually, if, I could slow down and really take a pause from being in like evictions are happening in my brain, would be to sort of do really intentional conversations with whether it's door knocking or phone calls or in a congregational setting or whatever it is, around housing development. Because one thing that we see, that we hear often, in fact, is sort of this, well, I support affordable housing, but I don't always want it next to me. And I think that's really real. And I don't think I'm even immune from it, of like, I live in a single family neighborhood on the north side. And if they were to say like this brand new building's going up in the corner, I think I might even be like, well, I want to hear more about this. I'm not so sure. But I do think that it is incredibly valid to lose parks and trees and green space and neighbors and a sense of like small village community, sort of. And also, I've been to public meetings. I can think of one in Minnetonka where people were basically like, we don't want those people here. And, using very veiled, but not even very veiled, like very kind of, this is about poor people or this is about Black people. I don't know what it's about, but it is full of hate, and that doesn't feel good to me. And so I think having those conversations is actually something that I don't know how we solve that without actually having sort of the Mr. Rogers conversations around compassion and around welcoming and around who we want to be to each other, because it feels like a very core thing. And so I don't know, that's one thing that I've been ruminating on in my brain for the last hour, is how do we change that? And I guess I don't totally, I don't know that I have all the answers, but I think a faith community is actually like a really important place for those conversations to start. And then secondly, I'm happy to talk through some of the like single family home stuff, but I would love to pause and get your questions too.
So, I have so many questions about like everything, but especially about Sukkot, but those are mostly kind of in the weeds, theological questions. Didn't want to derail. One thing that in my mind is possibly connected to single family home issues, as a new homeowner in the Western Metro, in a neighborhood that is, all property values are kind of ascendant right now.
Yeah.
Thinking about the issue of gentrification.
Yeah.
And, the fact that for most Americans that are able to own homes, the property they own is the vast majority of their financial assets. And so I'm wondering, just sort of resources that you've encountered to help someone like me think through very, very complicated relationship between property values and, you know, what's the line between organic community betterment that doesn't displace people and that still tries to add wealth and equity to neighborhoods that, you know, could use more financial assets. If that makes any sense, you can see that I'm definitely not, I definitely don't know what I'm talking about,
But I think the thing that, Aaron, you talked about it with your family, that St. Louis Park basically was founded as a community of starter homes. I mean, most of the home stock in St. Louis Park is typically the 1.5-story home, which was a nice starter home for families. And we raised our family in St. Louis Park, but as our kids got up into, used to be junior high, but now it's middle school, a lot of our friends and neighbors were moving out to Eagan, Apple Valley because they wanted the 3/4 to quarter, the larger bedrooms and not the small closets that we have in St. Louis Park. And so St. Louis Park has traditionally been a starter home, and we're not that way really anymore. A lot of people have done the McMansion things and torn off the roof and, put the 4 bedrooms, on the second floor and all that stuff on the same. So the small lot, they didn't buy the house next to them and tear it down. They just, the same small St. Louis Park lot. That's been historically where we're at. And now with the light rail coming through, we see this expansion and all these high-rise, high-end rental apartments. I mean, what used to be Horgard is now Horgard Village off on 7. And that's, that's what it is. And I think we're going to see more and more of that as the light rail actually comes through here. Is that a lot of the family homes are going to probably be displaced. So what happens, like you said, what happens to the school districts? When the family homes aren't there, I mean, some renters have children, but it's the gentrification of basically St. Louis Park. And it goes out into Hopkins too. I mean, we're a first ring suburb, Hopkins is second ring.
Yep.
Now, those are the trends that we're seeing. And again, you get the stigma of affordable housing. We live by Methodist Hospital. We live by what was Meadowbrook. And a lot of people in St. Louis Park used to call it Meadowbrook before it was bought out. And we actually live with that. Wooddale, we were part of a group that helped find places for the people who were displaced. And some of those people were displaced as far away as Brainerd. I mean, some of the renters in when it became Era. And so we actually they had to get storage space so they could store their stuff here until they found affordable housing in outstate Minnesota.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a problem we faced here in St. Louis Park, and it's not done.
Yeah, I do. When I was looking to buy a house, my mom was like, I will not let you buy a house in St. Louis Park in the same house that I grew up in off Texas and Sumter or whatever it was. And she was like, I will not let you buy that house for $350,000 because it's not worth that money. I lived in it when I was 10. And I was like, okay, well, I pretty much bought that house just in North Minneapolis is the thing. For not $350,000 though, luckily for me, because I'm a single man who works for a nonprofit. And yeah, I think, the change is sort of inevitable is the conclusion that I have come to. And, like the change benefited my family in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I think the change, like I said, the change is inevitable. And the question is who benefits and how do we make sure that everyone benefits? And because there is enough to make sure that everyone does. And so a lot of the work of the housing team has been sort of, well, we know that if we build all of these luxury apartments on the light rail route, that is going to primarily benefit like young, wealthy white people who want to live on the light rail or be close to uptown or whatever it is. But how do we also work into that, like helping those who maybe were displaced from Meadowbrook and get them back into the community too? Because that's the kind of community we think St. Louis Park should be. And, or those are the values that we want St. Louis Park to lead with. And there's another thing I was going to say, but I forgot. So yeah, I think the question of like who benefits from the situation and how can we sort of universalize that is one of the things that we try and hammer home or try to think through. And I don't know, Pastor Dan, does that answer your question?
I mean, if you discerned a question from what I rambled, then yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm trying to do a bit of work around like learning about the issues of gentrification and displacement, and it's very complicated. And how do we make sure that when the change happens, like you articulated, that there are resources, coming in and either very intentionally helping people who are getting displaced, so that they're not just like, oh, well, your rent's up, so, I guess that's it. Yeah, and
One thing that I would say is that, we love, maybe I'm opining to a bit, so you all can push back on me if that's true, but we love in this country to talk about individual choices and choices of individuals. And in fact, gentrification, I find to actually be like, it is not the coffee shop owner's fault who brings in the like hipster coffee shop that starts gentrification. Like it is the Met Council and the federal government are like pouring a lot of money into the light rail, which is bringing a lot of investment and attracting these huge investors to build these big apartment buildings. And that is going to raise all of the values of all of your homes in St. Louis Park and in the area, which will work out well for you in whenever you decide to sell, hopefully. But then the house you're going to buy is, looking at the market this year, is also going to be incredibly expensive. And so I think, to think about your role necessarily is like, for me, it's like, well, as a white person moving into North Minneapolis, I also had a very similar, like, what is my stake here? And I think it's about how do you be a good neighbor to your neighbors and like be welcoming and kind and compassionate and all of those sorts of things. But I don't feel like it is not my fault that that like my economic circumstances made it so that the only place I could own a home was North Minneapolis, but it is my responsibility to be a good neighbor. And I think that's sort of like the thing that it comes down to for me. The thing I will, oh, go ahead.
Well, I just don't maybe understand, but every single time I hear somebody talk about affordable housing, it always seems to me to be about renting. And people are concerned because it's going to be big rental complexes. Is there not any way to make housing affordable I know families who have lived in, 2-bedroom homes, and they've had, 8 people living in the 2-bedroom apartment. To me, it just frustrates me. Why can't we make houses affordable for people to move into them?
Because people are greedy.
Well, yeah, but
Developers.
I know, John, but then we get back to talking about what our personal responsibility is.
Yeah.
My personal responsibility is not to get the most money out of my house. My personal responsibility is to let people live in my house when I'm done with my house, right?
Yeah.
I'm not, I don't know. I know that's the way it is right now, but it's a very frustrating thing for me.
Yeah, for sure. It's like you see these apartment developments along the light rail, and you have, 3 units that are affordable, and 27 units that are luxury.
Right.
And they promote it as affordable housing.
Part of our problem is that in the western suburbs, and it's probably all around the Twin Cities, is the land that our houses are sitting on is probably more valuable than the house itself. So a lot of people are buying these pieces of property, and whether they tear off the roof and put on a second story, or tear it down to the foundation and build a whole brand new house like they did next to you, Don and Shar, right? I mean, that's
Yes,
what they're doing. And there's houses in our neighborhood they're doing the same thing with. Developers are buying up the houses and they're remodeling them, making these, mansions. And they're putting them on the market. A piece of property that probably would have sold for $400,000 2 years ago is going for $1.5 million.
Yeah.
But how do we stop that? How do we stop developers from buying up the homes? Who do we talk to in St.
Each
Louis? Park?
individual seller, because people are selling their houses for what they can get a bit for.
But shouldn't it be a city? I mean, if you're gonna have a city charter and you're gonna have some, we believe everybody in the city is we're for equity and blah, 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 step it up and do it, right?
Yeah.
So I do have one solution potentially, or a model at least, that I can talk through, that our neighbors in Edina are piloting, and they have their city hired like an affordable housing person, and St. Louis Park doesn't have an affordable housing like person on staff, but the program I think could be duplicated, which is there's an organization a model called a community land trust. Are any of you familiar with land trusts?
Yep.
So basically, the home is basically in the land that the home sits on is in a public trust that's leased for 99 years and basically held in trust forever. So when the people buy the home that sits on the land, they're only buying actually the value of the home, and it reduces the housing cost by like sometimes $40,000 or $50,000. So it makes it a little bit more affordable. One of the things that Edina did that was even additional to this is they basically said, we will offer loans to any single family homeowner to upgrade and remodel and sort of like, I think both in a sort of green electric sort of way, but also in just like if the home is from 1920, like it's going to need to be remodeled. And if you need capital for that, the city will help provide it. And the loan will be forgivable, or there's something about it where the loan is sort of like forgivable or forgiven at the time that you sell it. And if you agree to sell it to the city, and the city will immediately turn it over to the land trust, or the land trust will buy it from the city. And then it's basically both providing capital for sort of the more modest 1.5-story homes to be upgraded and maintained, and also then guarantees sort of a pipeline of keeping these homes at a more like affordable level. And I think they have funding right now in Edina to do like 10 homes this year or something, and I don't even know if they have any that have like agreed to do it. But it's sort of an interesting idea of like both being able to, I mean, I don't know exactly what, the homes that are being torn down in your neighborhoods and rebuilt from scratch with huge monster homes are, and if they need that sort of investment, but I would imagine that there are a fair amount that like could use $30,000 to do a new kitchen or something if you wanted to. And this both can help with that and make it so the homes don't necessarily need to be torn down in the same way, and also is a pipeline into affordability. And it's one of the things that I'm most excited about in terms of like very local policy. I think one of the things maybe I didn't mention is like when I joined JCA in 2017, like Donald Trump had just taken over as president, Republicans controlled the Senate, and there was not a lot that was going to happen in terms of like equitable housing policy at the federal government or at the state government. And so having really local policy solutions was really important when I first started on Suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition. And I think this is one of the things that the more I talk to folks in the suburbs, like this is a phenomenon that is happening all across the metro. And I think that I don't know if this solution is perfect, because I do think the downside of a land trust is that when you go to sell that home, you're not going to get any sort of value for it on the market, really, because you like have to pay back the $40,000 essentially. So the financing is funny, and you don't get the same sort of capital return that you might get. But it is a way to maintain that the houses are more affordable for sure. And I think it's a really exciting idea. So that's my like one thing I wanted to mention before our time was up on that front.
I can talk to you about community land trust for like 7 hours. I'm
Oh, no, that's okay.
incredibly, no, yeah, I know. What I'm saying is I am personally really interested in it. It's so cool to hear about that, Aaron. I kind of wish Cassie and I would have known about that. We just bought in Minneapolis. Maybe we could have bought in Edina. I'm not sure we would have been able to afford in Edina. So it kind of,
Not on your.
but John knows. But one of the things that Judy sort of, you mentioned that, and I think that the community land trust really is an interesting and I think compelling model because of that permanent affordability. It takes it out of that speculative land market where people are coming in to just flip it and make, and not just people, I mean, like, hedge funds are buying properties, right? And just flipping it to as an investment. There's some limits on sort of what equity people can put in and sort of take out. But one of the things that Cassie and I are thinking about is sort of, we bought this home also with the idea that we would live in it for a long time. I'm inspired by the number of you in this congregation who've been in your homes for longer than I've been alive. But live in it, and then depending on where things are out, sell it at a discount to the City of Lakes Community Land Trust, or donate it if we're in a position, right? And I think there's some questions about where our social safety net is going to be at the time when we're retired, and what's available for us to move into a different place. But so we're excited about that. And sort of, Judy, what you said about sort of this personal responsibility to, have someone live in my house when I'm done with it. I think that's just a really, I think the community land trust, again, not a perfect model, but something that allows for that sort of communal ownership. And there's ways that we can participate in it and add to that as individuals that I don't think we've tapped into. So I'm happy to talk with people more about it because it's something that we're going to be talking with the City of Lakes Community Land Trust about, sort of putting even just like we'll give them first right of refusal. We'll say that sort of right now, and sort of we'll put together a legal document. So that's something that we're thinking about as well. So
Yeah, and to Aaron's point about the return on your property, because you have to pay back the loan. I mean, if you're in your house for 30 years, with the history that we've experienced, you're going to have an enormous gain. And, a $30,000 hit on that gain is a lot of money, but still it's a very significant return that you're going to recognize. So, like I say, a lot of this stuff is just because of people's individual greed. And if we can kind of develop the Mr. Rogers philosophy that I don't have to get the most that I can out of everything that I do, enough is enough kind of thing. If we can develop that philosophy, that would go a long way to addressing the problem.
To just kind of stay on the affordability of single family housing. So the house we own now is our second house. I came from the Sioux Falls area, but not Sioux Falls itself. Brandon, which is a suburb of Sioux Falls, in so much as Sioux Falls is an urban. So we got that house, a nice starter home in a good neighborhood, in a good school district, worth $1,000, $1,000 down, because of the Rural Housing Development Fund, the federal government. And every single community in the state of South Dakota qualifies for rural housing development because South Dakota is rural. Sioux Falls, Rapid City, and Aberdeen did not qualify for rural housing development. Every other city there does. I don't know, I'm not a realtor or anything like that. But I think about that too, and if we as a society want to be concerned about folks not having a high barrier of entry, like, you know, there were even qualifiers, you know, I had to prove to them that I didn't have a job, that I was going to be able to manage this debt or whatever. But I wonder too about I love the idea of sort of the take to the cities and the local government thinking there too, but I also wonder too, as a society at large, you know, what are the policies that would be beneficial to creating equitable housing in the country? That's a huge, so many markets, you know, like. But.
Well, yeah, I would say that we used to guarantee housing in this country. After the, you know, part of the New Deal was a huge investment in public housing and building that program. And almost immediately, all of the funding got cut for it, and then it started to get torn down and disinvested in. And you know, we think back on sort of like the projects of the 80s and 90s, and sort of the poverty, the war on poverty from that. And I think that we never really gave that program a fair shake. And we also, you know, at the same time as that program was getting started, we also pretty much guaranteed that any white family that wanted to could own a home and build a home through VA loans and other HFA loans, things like that. And so, you know, I think the scale of, like, you know, to be topical, the war in Afghanistan, we could house every American if we wanted to. It's really a choice. And so, yeah, that's hard reality to swallow, but it sort of is true that we totally could do it. It's just kind of a matter of will. I put the Dinah in the chat. If you're someone who was looking at the chat, there's a little bit more about that program, which I think when I have time, or when Caleb or Pastor Dan have time to bring together the St. Louis Park Housing team, hopefully with a lot of your faces there soon, would love to bring that to city council members and people say, look, we see this in our neighborhoods all the time of our fellow houses getting torn down, and what can we do to slow it even? So.
Well, I think we all agree that, you know, everybody needs to have a safe, stable place. And we've seen it a lot in St. Louis Park. When our youngest daughter was growing up, was when
Oh, no.
Censorship.
living in a 2-bedroom apartment. I mean, multi-generation, 3 or 4 generations, like immigrants did when our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came to America, and they felt, that they had a place to live. Of course, they wanted to move into something different, but that's what they could afford at the time.
And unfortunately, we lost you halfway through what you were saying. Your computer froze there for a minute.
I just think it's the idea that people have to have a place to call their own, whether it's a rental unit or something else, and the definition can be different from person to person depending on what their needs are. But that was, we've seen that through all generations. When our ancestors immigrated to America, they moved to communities. St. Paul had every European community. There was a German neighborhood, there was a Swedish neighborhood, there was Norwegian neighborhoods, and their kids went to school and they moved out to the suburbs and kept doing the same thing. But even people today need those same starter place to call home to be safe, and not that they're going to get moved out next month because their rents increase and they can't afford to live there.
Yep, thank you, yeah.
Well, it was really great spending an hour and a half with all of you. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you for being here, Aaron. I really appreciated all that, and like I said, I got a bunch of questions, and I got to crack into a few of the books that I ordered last time I started going down the housing rabbit hole. So,
well, I won't be in town for Sukkot this year, Pastor Dan, but next year you're welcome to come to my sukkah if you have questions.
that would be awesome. What day does Sukkot start?
Starts September 17th, or no, it's sometime around then. It's
Okay.
like a Wednesday that week. Maybe it's the 22nd or 20th or something like that.
I'm sure it's on my calendar.
Yeah, it's around then.
It's a major holiday, so. Well, again, thank you, Aaron, for being here. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us, and thank you all for taking time out of your Tuesday evening to think about how we are to be good neighbors and to create neighborhoods where all God's people can land and have that safe place to call home. So thank you for your engagement. The Homeline and St. Louis Park Housing Team, get curious about how to become involved. If you're your imagination is kind of moving now in those areas, and tell a friend about this conversation. It was recorded, so they can listen to this in the discussion in its entirety if they would like to engage with that too. So with that, I say God's peace to you all. Have a wonderful evening, Aaron. Blessings as you move about the world and travel and do all manner of things. And be well, everyone.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Aaron.
Thank you.
Bye
Thank
now.
you.